Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Timothy Mills, and I'm going to be your host for today's session. So now we're going to have this session on multi-team development with AWS CDK and AWS CodeArtifact by James Little, who is an AWS cloud architect, and also Alison Linton. So let's give it up for Alison Linton and begin the session. Thank you.
Thank you. I am Ali Linton. I live and work on Wadjuk country in Boorloo, which you might know as Perth. Today I'm quite far from home. I'm in the land of the Ngunnawal people, and I thank the Ngunnawal people, I thank their elders for their continued care of this land, and I acknowledge their ownership of it. I am committed to walking alongside all Australians to learn their stories and to move into the future together. So I am the Cloud Services Manager at Curtin University. I'm here today with James Little. He's a cloud architect with AWS Professional Services. And we're here today to talk about AWS CDK and AWS CodeArtifact and how Curtin has used them to enable rapid development in distributed teams, how we have shared code between teams, and how we've kept our security and our architecture and our governance teams happy throughout the process. So here's what we're going to talk about today. First, I'll set the scene. I'll talk a little bit about the problem we're solving, the reasons that led to Curtin's need to transform, and some of my requirements for the solution. I'll pass you over to James. He'll talk you through the technical solution. There'll be a demo, some time for questions. Curtin University's main campus is in Perth, Western Australia. I happen to think it's the best university in the world. I'm hoping at least a couple people in this room might agree with me. Perth is in the time zone of GMT +8, which is home to nearly 25% of the world's population. This creates some interesting opportunities for anyone in that time zone, for any university in that time zone. You see, education's changing. The students that are graduating high school now, they're what we call digital natives. They grew up with a device in their hand. And what they want out of their education, it's different to what previous generations wanted. They're no longer satisfied with a lecturer standing at the front of the room, presenting to the assembled group. They're also no longer satisfied with watching that recording back later. What they want is human-centred, omni-channel, high-quality digital experiences, and they want to choose where and when they consume them. What this means for universities is we're now competing not only with the people in our own city, but with everyone in our time zone and indeed across the world. It also means that there's some really good opportunities for universities that understand this new breed of student. At Curtin, we're excited about these opportunities. We do believe that we understand this new breed of student, and the way we will differentiate ourselves is with technology. What this means for digital and technology solutions, the IT department at Curtin, my team, is that we need to change our application development practices so that we can get out of our own way and be able to rapidly build the products that Curtin needs to serve this new type of student. Have you ever felt like that at work? I have. Everything at Curtin was in the one environment. Everyone was in the one environment. That early 2000s obsession with centralisation had left us with these siloed, activity-focused teams with heavy dependencies on one another. We had operating system teams and application support teams, app devs, integration devs. You get the idea. The smooth running of IT at Curtin relied on people with deep historical knowledge of the way that we had done things, and great interpersonal relationships between the teams. You had to know who in the next team over could do your job for you and perhaps call in a favour to get it done. There were clear problems with this model. It was great for BAU. It was not so great for projects. Because we were passing jobs from team to team, there was the potential for traffic jams. If you knew the shortcuts, you could drive your project through, but if you didn't, you were going to get stuck. We had this giant backlog of projects and we weren't moving them through fast enough. We had no realistic way to scale. For Curtin to deliver, we needed to change our model. As a manager, I want the speed of those shortcuts, but I can't have people cutting corners. And as we scale, that becomes so much more important because I can't be everywhere at once. We needed a new way to deliver that would allow us to deliver more applications and faster. So how do you do that? How do you build the way to scale our application delivery without compromising on quality? Well, first, we chose to move to multidisciplinary product-focused teams. We reduced the dependencies, we free people up for delivering value. We decided to build a new digital platform, new roads, with a focus on automation, security guardrails, and self-service tools. And finally, we focused on reducing the intersections. What do I mean by intersections? Well, if you think about all the points in a project where you have to stop and checkpoint with another team, it's typically security, architecture, governance. And so wherever possible, we figure out what architecture patterns are in use, bring those decisions forward, and we make them once. And then you package up those decisions so that other teams can benefit from them and clear the path. It would allow us to modernise the way we do application development and clear the road to allow our teams to deliver new experiences faster. So these are the goals that we identified for modernising our application development at Curtin. Firstly, we needed to shorten our onboarding time, both for projects and for people. For projects, I need everything we need to deliver a project to be ready in hours, not days or weeks. And then we need our staff to be ready too. A key deliverable of our digital transformation project was the retraining of our staff, something that our CIO, Jason Cowie, was talking about this morning on the Transforming the Public Sector with Reskilling at Scale panel. For some teams, this transition's really easy, but for other teams, we're asking them to work in a new paradigm, new tools, new programming languages. It's scary. So by providing them with quality tools and quality training, we ease that transition and make them feel confident to move with us. We also need to scale our senior developers. I don't need to tell this room, resourcing in the IT sector is tough right now. I need to place our senior devs where I can get the most value out of their knowledge. They need to be able to oversee their projects, full visibility of their CI/CD pipelines, their operations and observability, so that they can guide their teams effectively. Also need to reduce their decision fatigue. It doesn't make sense for every product team to decide the best way to deliver an application. Instead, you bring those decisions into the centre and you make them once. You provide them with the tools so that they can get on with making the decisions that matter. And finally, we need to apply security and governance consistently and upfront. We want to go fast, but we're a university. We have regulatory and audit requirements and the kind of risk appetite that comes with being a public org. You guys are at a public sector summit. I'm guessing some of you might have the same challenges. When you're under pressure, security can be one of the first casualties. So by building it into our platform, building it into our patterns, we can ensure it doesn't get lost and it removes that load from our devs. This is where pattern-based development is really powerful. It means that best practices become the norm. Finally, I need to enable distributed teams but retain oversight. And what I mean by that is product teams need to have control of their domain, but my team, the cloud platform engineering team, I need them to be able to see everything in the platform and where their attention might be warranted. So these were our goals in modernising application development, and we had a go. In 2020, we built something, we called it the assembly line. It was CloudFormation based. It was more than just a CI/CD pipeline. It was a way to package and distribute our patterns so that all teams could benefit from it. In some ways, it worked really well. It was great for infrastructure, but for application development, it just wasn't working. When professional services came on board to help us with our transformation project, one of the first things that James did was he asked us the tough questions about where it was working and where it wasn't working. We decided that the language was wrong and some of our design ideas weren't quite there. So we ended up throwing out the bulk of the code base. We kept a lot of the concepts and built something entirely new. So I'll hand over to James. He'll tell you all about the new solution and why it's so awesome.
Thanks, Ali. Just going to get a bit of a sense of the room. Like, who would consider, if you think about your role, would you consider yourself to be part of a central enabling team or a development team? So who would consider themselves part of a central enabling function? Great. And who's sort of more on the front end development, like building things out? Great. Okay, so there's two different perspectives in this talk. So we'll keep an eye on that. But first, we're going to get into the technical side and we need to set a few terms. So this is a level 300, so it's sort of an anticipation that you know a bit about CDK and the like. But the key question is for Curtin, why CDK? So Ali just mentioned that they had CloudFormation, they had patterns, these things were kind of working to a degree. And so, with CDK though, they also had a lot of developers. And the pieces that weren't really working were the application side. So with CDK, the real benefit for Curtin was that you can use procedural languages to do your infrastructure as code for both your application and for your infrastructure. You can do inline tests, and also with CodeArtifact and Construct Hub, you have a way to distribute your patterns and the design documentation that goes with them. So in the following slides, we've got the CDK Bootstrap, which is shown as a CloudFormation stack because that's what it is. But when you see that, think about the way a central team might want to structure accounts for other teams and control the permissions that they're allowed to have and where they're allowed to deploy. Now, AWS CodeArtifact, has anybody used anything like JFrog, any of the JFrog family? Got a couple. Or Sonatype Nexus? Okay, so for all of you who have used those products, you know the sort of the space AWS CodeArtifact is in. For those that don't, AWS CodeArtifact is the AWS native repository and package manager. So it enables a central team to control the public sort of repositories of libraries, but also gives the opportunity to publish your own libraries internally. Won't ask questions about your CI/CD. I assume everyone knows about CI/CD, and we'd be here all afternoon if we went through all the products. Code Pipeline is the Amazon, AWS managed service for CI/CD, and for Curtin, this is used both upfront in the publishing mechanism and also downstream for the application developers. And finally, Construct Hub is sort of an open source way of, it's a public sort of application. You can share constructs, build and share constructs. But it has a self-hosted model. And for Curtin, we used Construct Hub in that self-hosted model so that they could privately build and share their own constructs between the teams. Okay, so with those terms set, let's talk about moving fast securely. And Ali's laid out these challenges that Curtin was having, all these intersections, all these places where things could slow down, where maybe it's about the people, maybe it's about the process, maybe it's about the technology, that single environment everyone's in. And really, the perspective that she wanted to give the developers was this sort of clear runway, this sort of perspective that you don't have any intersections, making the right way the easy way for the developers. And that's kind of the picture you want for the central team enabling developers to move forward. But that's a little bit simplistic. And as a central team, you need intersections. You need, the governance, the security. And the challenge here that we tried to do with Curtin was how to get those necessary intersections and have them flow into the development environments. So, thinking about those two things, let's look at these challenges. Ali mentioned shortening onboarding time, and primarily today we'll think about project onboarding. She mentioned the challenge of scaling senior developers and applying security and governance. And in framing the question, I want to think about how can we actually solve these problems, all of these challenges in a centrally managed way. So we'll get into the first one, which is project onboarding, and I'll move over here. So there are those two types of, shortening of onboarding times you can think of. You can think of your development cycle time, how long between me writing a line of code until I can actually see the result of that code. We're not really talking about that. This is more about how long does it take to get from a blank slate to somewhere where you can start building useful business rules. So we're thinking about the environments, we're thinking about all of the tools, and how can the central team enable developers in that space? So in AWS terms, Ali mentioned everyone was in one environment, but you can perfectly duplicate a pattern really easily in AWS. And so this concept of a DevOps hub for a team and their dev, test, and prod, or however many lifecycle accounts you need for a team, can be duplicated so that each team feels like they've got their own space. And one of the ways to do that, apart from creating accounts, is the bootstrapping. Because you can say that in this particular DevOps hub for Team A, they can deploy to this specific dev account, this specific test account, this specific prod account. But importantly, they can't deploy to Team B's accounts. Today I won't talk about integration, but you can extend this pattern where you need to integrate across teams. And this means that the central team can apply structure to the rest of the teams so that they don't have to do it themselves. They just turn up and start using their own isolated or segregated environment. Also, what we did at Curtin was to put AWS CodeArtifact into their DevOps hub. So every team has their own artifact repository, so they can deploy and innovate on what they need to. So if Team A is building 30 applications, the senior devs are probably going to see some commonalities, and they're going to want to experiment and try to make their life easier and build some patterns. So this isn't the central artifact repository, this is their own repository. And so if they're getting the benefit of some 15 odd patterns, but they want to experiment on this other one, what happens is that the security accreditation kind of focus is looking at variations from the norm instead of trying to assess everything repeatedly for every team. If you can assess each pattern once up front, you can then use it confidently and just make sure people are using it. But if someone's innovating in their own space, that's where you can focus your security and governance activities. So at Curtin, the senior devs were in the teams, but they were also taking those patterns out into the shared spaces. So let's look at how Curtin looked to scale their senior developers. So when a senior developer was looking to build a pattern out, this is kind of their perspective of the world. They've got their code repo for the central patterns, and here we've got the central team who's also building out patterns for everybody. You've got areas with application developers and several other specialties. And if you think about your organisation, you've probably got a bunch of specialties where people could bring all of their expertise to bear. But what we didn't want the senior devs thinking about was how to move their patterns from A to B, how to publish them, how to manage them, who's using them. All of that was managed by the central team. And to do that, we brought back in that concept of the assembly line. And the central team managed a single publishing pipeline that brought all these patterns together, applied all of the security testing that the organisation wanted, and then published into the shared AWS CodeArtifact. The central team can manage the public repositories and also do all of the plumbing and connections required to make that available to all of the other teams. And importantly, in that assembly line is where you can put your architecture and governance. So if a team is already built out of version 1 of some pattern, that pattern can be used as, for those developers in that clear path. I've got this available, I can use it. But the senior devs can kind of shop it around, go through all the necessary security, architecture meetings, governance, what else is required for this version 2, without slowing down any of the developers. And when it's ready, all the plumbing is handled by the assembly line, by the central team. So if we think about this, let's go back to the developer perspective. And we're thinking about shortening the development onboarding time, the project onboarding time. And what we want for that clear runway for the developers is them thinking about as little as possible. If Ali mentioned that the Curtin team were transforming from other languages into, the CDK here. So they needed a kick, like a rapid acceleration and a start. So we want them thinking just about where their repository is, what their code is, and their workstation. But we've already seen that it's a little bit more complicated than that. And the central team is managing their hub and their lifecycle accounts. And there's all these senior devs creating all these patterns. And 2 of those we'll see in the demo, a single-page web app, a fairly interesting pattern with lots of managed services involved and lots of security policy involved. and an API gateway API. And to get a little bit recursive, the CI/CD pipeline that everyone uses to deploy their applications is built by the central team. And if you think about trying to get a group of developers to unify on an idea for CI/CD, you'll think about how complicated that pipeline is potentially going to be. All these edge cases start creeping in. So the point being, it's not a simple component. So the developers now got all of this, and then they're wondering, how do I get these artifacts? Where are these artifacts? I've got this local repository, I've got my team repository. And one final bit of the complexity is that the developers wanted to be able to change the pipeline. You know, some of them are doing mono-repo, some of them are not. How do I do that effectively? How do I move fast while still being able to do my job? And so now we've gone from this simple, clear runway to a fairly complete but complicated set of services. So we took the next step and we wrapped code generation around this. And this goes to that, getting started quickly. And the code generation made much of this complexity fade into the background. So the developer's back to thinking about, where's my code, what am I writing, and what's my workstation? In this sort of world where they've landed, if they landed here, they're thinking, where do I get my artifacts from? Am I running in the context of my workstation? Am I running in the context of my pipeline? How do I even interact with CodeArtifact and with all these temporary credentials and resource policies and cross-account policies? There's a lot going on here that the central team's taking away from the developers. But it's still there, and they can use the code generation as hooks and pointers into how all this works. Because if you're writing code, you can read some code generation code, and you can see where all the markers are, and it helps you to learn. But we want to get back to this clear runway. So let's put this in context of security and governance. So you've got the developer concerns we want them to have on the left there, and we've got this CDK pipeline that's been generated for them. And into that we can think about these patterns being incorporated. It's actually in the code, not the pipeline, but you can think about it as being in the pipeline. The security and governance can be baked into what they're building. And then the actual sort of security services and the policies can also be applied in the pipeline. Remembering this is the pipeline built by the central team, so that can iterate and change. So when Curtin started, they used CDK NAG, but they also then were able to add to all the teams end-to-end functional testing, automated, or postman testing for APIs. And so when you see CDK NAG, think of your sort of static or dynamic analysis tool of choice. And you can actually build out over time for everyone all of the necessary complexity you need for policy into the pipeline that everyone's using. And in terms of the demo, this is exactly what we're going to have a look at. So let's get into the demo. So Curtin tasked one of their interns, Leo, with building this. And if you've got sort of, a few years AWS experience, maybe you look at it and you go, yeah, that's good. But if you're an intern straight out of uni and you don't have 10 years IT experience, you don't have 5 years AWS experience, this is a mountain, right? You've got a lot of good services here. Shield, you've got web application firewalls, what rules do I put on that? You've got CloudFront, you've got, the assets with the branding for the organization, PKI certificates and domains, and how do they relate to each other? There's a lot of, really good complexity in this pattern. And Leo also had to connect the single-page web app pattern, which is sort of up this end here, with a different pattern, which is the API backend gateway. And this is one of those advantages of patterns that you can actually assemble them together. And they work, but they also work nicely individually. And today, it'll be a Hello World app from the intern, but in practice, it also hooks into the federated identities if you're going to add in a login page. Additionally, because of all the work that the central team did, you've got all the security services baked in, your CloudTrail, your logging, your compliance, your security, your guard duty, and your KMS. But the senior devs also put in what they want from every Lambda function and every API in terms of centralized monitoring. So that your intern who hasn't yet had to debug at 2 in the morning, doesn't know they need various sort of logs in there, they get the benefit if they use the pattern. And we'll see that Leo managed to assemble all of this in about 35 lines of code and a Lambda in about an afternoon. So let's get in and have a look at that demo. Leo starts from scratch. He's got a brand new repository. Curtin uses Bitbucket. And then he installs and uses the code generator, which is a tool called Yeoman. And Leo actually wrote this. The code generation is quite easy to do. And the code generator asks questions. Where are you deploying? What's your environment? Which account are you going to? And then it will generate all the base application code for you to get started. So you're not starting with a blank slate. And let's just pause and have a bit of a look at these files and what's happened. Right up front, there's this reference to the pipeline code, so that if you need to change the defaults, you can, but you don't have to. There's a whole bunch of files here. If you've used CDK, these will probably mean something to you. There's a full application here with a back-end and a front-end stack. Also, this code generation integrates with all those isolation and segregation mechanisms. So the CDK JSON is using the bootstrapping with a qualifier that means Leo doesn't have to worry about overwriting someone else's code. It's all baked in. So that environment separation, where you have team A over here and team B over there, that's baked into the code generation. Leo doesn't have to think about it. And the package JSON incorporates all of those patterns from the senior devs. So when you're starting, even like switching from one language to another, one of the challenges is what works. And so this code generation gives you that this works. You can start here. Having got all that, Leo goes in and has a bit of a look. There's already a pipeline generated for him. It's got his back-end stack and it's got his front-end stack. It's got a config file, so that if he wants to modify that. But he doesn't have to do any of that. So Leo does go and have a look at the config file, and you can see that it's simple YAML. So that when he wants, and there's instructions for how to deploy to your test environment when you're ready. It does your end-to-end testing and your security testing. Now, if Leo wants to go further, he can go and look in Construct Hub and see the documentation associated with this pipeline, and see that there's actually lots of opportunities for overriding and customizing. So that's where Construct Hub gives you both the discoverability of patterns, but also more information about the pattern, so that you don't have to, so you can keep your architecture and your design together and make it easy for people to see. This is actually the first version of this pipeline for Curtin, and it has some mandatory stages like security testing. But because of the mono-repo debate versus a single repo debate, there's quite a bit of customization allowed. And over time, the intent is that as those debates happen and the teams settle on these 3 patterns for how we do CI/CD, those get baked in as the 3 pipelines. And then you have a code generator for each. This one also shows, there's blog posts for all of this, but Postman integration for your APIs. So if you're building an API, you just have to provide your file, and the pipeline tests it for you and fails the build if your tests fail. But again, you just have to think about Postman stuff. And I put down a publish at the end because I think in Canberra, there's probably a sense of wanting to do a different pattern to the GitLab flow. And just wanted to mention that if you are not doing GitLab flow and your intent is, well, I need to publish an artifact and then use that artifact and deploy through the environments, which is fairly common with your MD5 checking or whatever it is these days, that's where you'd probably put a publish step, and then you'd change the pipeline up to just go and do the deploys to the next environments. Really flexible though. Okay, so Leo's done, he's looked at all these pipelines, he decides he needs no changes whatsoever. So now he gets into the scripts, or it gets into the code rather, and here is where he makes his customizations to the blank slate. You can see the imports for the other libraries, sorry, they went away, and you can see the sort of the base API gateway and the base Lambda function. So this is extra components that the Curtin senior devs have wrapped up monitoring into, and the best practices and the security. Once he's done the back-end stack, moves to the front end, and he's got to do this single-page web app. Fortunately, 6 lines of code will get him there. So Leo pretty much says, this is the name of my app, and this is where you find the files. So for an intern, this is a great head start. And that's already got all the branding, it's already got the complexity. This isn't a simple construct. You've got origin access identities, you've got all the TLS settings you want to have on your CloudFront distros. Any other settings you want to do if you want to limit your CloudFront distros to always be pointing internal. The options for creating a pattern that makes sense for your organisation, are huge. But Leo, again, doesn't have to worry about it. So let's have a look and see what happens when he actually starts to build this out. So we're going to go through a few scripts here. These can fade into the background, but we've done them manually to show you. There's a credential helper, which I'll link to in the next few slides. This just smooths the path between the CDK permissions and the way that CLI permissions work. And so Leo, again, doesn't have to worry about those. He just goes ahead and, who am I? This is me. Keep moving on. This file here, which is again usually in the background, this brings into his context, whether that's his pipeline or his local in this case, all the things he needs to do, or he needs to be able to actually go and log into all the CodeArtifact repos. So he doesn't have to worry about the structures. Here it logs into 2 different CodeArtifact repositories to get temporary credentials. But the intern doesn't need to know about that. That's complexity that is sort of peripheral to what they're trying to achieve. And here we get to the bits that we hope the intern does know coming out of uni, a bit of Git and a little bit of maybe a bit of CDK deploys. So he pushes all of this code that he's only had to write 35 lines of it, and then he goes ahead and does a CDK deploy. And because the credential helper up front set where he's meant to be, this deploys to the right location and builds a pipeline that then deploys the back-end and front-end stacks. So after deploying, let's just skip ahead and see what it is that happens in the console. And, Leo's got a problem. In the code that he wrote, he changed something that broke security policy, or wasn't in line with security policy. And as this comes down, you'll see that there was this S3 star permission that he intentionally added that was different from the pattern. And at Curtin, no, you're not allowed to do that. And so here is an example of how in the pipeline that Leo can't change, security policy has been applied for him, and something that he's not really aware of, breaks the build. But it's easy for him to see, it's easy for him to fix. And this is a standard kind of CDK pipelines model. I've got a link later if you want to dig into how to do CDK pipelines and how they work. This is a self-mutating pipeline. But the point I want to make today is that Leo didn't need to know all that. This is the pipeline that was generated for him. It does his back-end stack. It does his front-end stack. And it built in all of that security and governance that the senior devs and also the security team wanted him to have. And finally, we get to Hello World. And of course, he should say Canberra. And here, just remembering what's gone on, he's built a single-page web app with 35 lines of code, with an API backend, all secure, all governed. It's gone all the way through that architecture with custom code that he's written. In an environment that's secured by a central team, 35 lines of code, a Lambda, and an afternoon. So in terms of the benefits of what we were trying to show, this was what we were trying to wrap up together. But Ali, are there any other benefits that you've seen out of this?
Thanks, James. Look, we've come through our development cycle now. We're starting to onboard teams into using our new tool now. And I think the thing that we're seeing most of all is we're really reducing our time to that first deploy. The code generation's coming in so handy there. People who are new to this tool are able to walk in, follow our tutorial, and they can be up and running almost immediately. We're onboarding a lot of teams, and so currently we've got 6 teams working with our tool, but the most exciting thing for me is that it's not just the teams that we expected to see. And so, for example, we've just onboarded the Curtin Institute for Radio Astronomy. They had an idea for a citizen science application. They approached us, and they're able to use our single-page app, Pattern, to be able to deploy their project. I know that they're working securely. I know that their application is deployed according to our best practice. It has our branding appropriately. And they don't have to worry about that. They get on with the science in the middle, so everybody wins. We're noticing that everyone's starting to contribute and we're all in the same conversation. So if someone has an observation about the way we're doing CI/CD, everyone's in the same conversation, and any changes that we make, everybody benefits from. And then we're just reducing our complexity of our solutions. Less code means less errors. So they're the kind of things we're seeing.
So just on the screen are the additional resources I mentioned. Just wanted to also focus in on that last one. If you actually want to build out compliant patterns in your organisation, do have a look at that next level, level 400. There was a talk at Sydney Summit just recently, and Dina's keep an eye out as well for a solution in that space from Dina. You've got the other ones there, the Credential Helper and the Advanced CDK Workshop. And I'll just wait there for a moment. And then we only have a couple of minutes, but are there any questions?
I've worked with CDK at CSIRO, and one thing I found challenging with CDK pipelines and code pipeline is integrating with GitHub pull requests.
Okay.
Just wondering, we have a lot of the developers used to the Git flow of make a pull request, watch the CI come through, then merge to main and deploy from there. I'm just wondering if you guys have any advice on, is that integration possible, easy sort of workarounds?
That's a very big question for the time we have, but I'd probably just say as well, the question was about Git flow and about integrating with pull requests. At Curtin, we didn't actually do that. So I might actually take that one offline if you like. Happy to chat about it later. I guess the one point I did want to make, this was a GitLab flow pipeline, but that was a choice. So it's certainly possible to adapt for your own sort of strategies. Any other questions? Looks quiet. Do feel free to come up afterwards and have a chat. More than happy to. Otherwise, just mention again, you've probably heard this a few times today, but do encourage you to look at the training available and the certifications. I've personally found the certifications to be really useful in my journey of learning about AWS. And also, on behalf of Ali and myself, thank you very much for choosing this session and for your time. It's been fantastic, and please do remember to fill out the session survey. The number I think you're looking for is up the top end, but whatever you do is great. We love the feedback. So thanks very much, everyone.